Karoline Leavitt had walked into the studio of the Morning Current with confidence. She had done countless interviews before, some tense, some challenging, but always expected. This was just another opportunity to debate, to defend her views, to make her case to an audience that might not agree with her, but would at least hear her out. As the studio lights cast a sharp glow over the modern, minimalist set, Karoline adjusted the lapel microphone clipped to her blouse. She had been invited to discuss media bias, a topic she knew inside and out. As a rising conservative commentator, she had spent much of her career highlighting discrepancies in how news was reported, dissecting narratives, and challenging the so-called objectivity of major networks. She expected a tough conversation, maybe even an aggressive one, but what she didn't expect was how quickly the segment would spiral out of control. Across from her sat Paul Danning, a man who had spent decades mastering the art of televised confrontation. He wasn't just a journalist. He was an institution, a name that commanded respect and, at times, even fear. His reputation had been built on hard-hitting interviews that left his guests flustered, backtracking, or, in some cases, completely undone. Danning didn't just ask questions. He dissected his guests. He prided himself on exposing hypocrisy, on pushing beyond prepared sound bites, on forcing his interviewees into moments of uncomfortable truth. It was this ability that had made the Morning Current a must-watch for millions. But his style wasn't without its critics. Many accused him of bullying rather than interviewing, of using his position not to uncover truth, but to dominate conversations, turning them into verbal battlegrounds where he always emerged victorious. And today, his opponent was Karoline Leavitt, a young, articulate conservative voice who had built her own reputation on never backing down. She wasn't a rookie, nor was she someone easily flustered. If Paul expected her to cower under pressure, he had made a grave miscalculation. The segment began as expected, a discussion about media bias. Paul came out swinging, his tone deceptively polite, but unmistakably sharp. "Karoline, let's talk about the so-called conservative media bias," he started, leaning slightly forward. Right-wing outlets have spent years pushing a narrative that mainstream news organizations, ours included, are deliberately distorting facts. Yet time and again, we see conservative networks peddling misinformation, half-truths, and conspiracy theories. Do you honestly believe your side is being treated unfairly? Karoline didn't flinch. She had anticipated this line of attack. With a composed smile, she met his gaze. "What I believe, Paul, is that the mainstream media has a track record of selective reporting. If a story aligns with a certain political agenda, it's amplified. If it doesn't, it's buried or reframed. I can give you example after example. Stories misrepresented, context omitted, narratives shaped to fit a preferred outcome." Paul smirked. He had heard it all before. "So you're saying that networks like ours are manipulating the truth?" "I'm saying that all media, including conservative outlets, have biases," Karoline replied evenly. "But the difference is networks like yours claim absolute objectivity while dismissing any dissenting view as misinformation. That's not journalism. That's narrative control." The air between them thickened. Producers in the control room exchanged glances. The debate was heating up faster than expected, but so far it was still within bounds. And then it happened. Paul leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just a notch, his expression tightening. The shift was almost imperceptible, but to a seasoned viewer, it was clear something had changed. "You know," he said, his tone now edged with frustration, "people like you are exactly why this country is backsliding." The words hung in the air like a slow-motion car crash. Karoline blinked, her expression unreadable, but sharp intelligence flickered in her eyes. She had handled difficult interviews before, but this was different. This wasn't debate. It was personal. "Excuse me," she said, her voice measured. Paul didn't backtrack. In fact, he doubled down. "You and others like you keep pushing this fake narrative of victimhood," he continued. "You act like conservatives are being silenced when, in reality, you're the ones trying to control the conversation. You're not fighting for free speech. You're fighting for power." The studio fell silent. Even the background on the production crew seemed to dim. This wasn't just a pointed question. This was an accusation. And it wasn't just about Karoline. It was about conservatives as a whole. She could have interrupted. She could have met his intensity with equal force. But instead, she did something far more powerful. She let the moment hang. Then, calmly, she asked, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by people like you?" A flicker of something, realization, hesitation, crossed Paul's face. Paul had been in the business long enough to recognize a trap when he saw one. He could have backtracked, softened his words, or explained himself in a way that diffused the situation. Instead, he made the worst possible choice. "Oh, come on, Karoline," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "You know exactly what I meant." The moment was electric. With those 5 words, he sealed his fate. Because now, it didn't matter what he had meant. It only mattered how it was perceived. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "So just to be clear," she said, "when you said your people, you weren't referring to anything beyond political ideology?" Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. He hesitated, just for a second, but a second was all it took. If he admitted he had misspoken, he would look weak. If he pushed back, he would look defensive. Either way, he had lost control of the conversation. So he did what seasoned debaters often do when cornered. He tried to shift the goalposts. "Oh, don't play the victim here," he snapped. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This bad faith outrage, twisting words to manufacture controversy. You know exactly what I meant." Karoline didn't flinch. She let his words hang, let the silence stretch, let the audience draw their own conclusions. And then she delivered the final blow. "I don't need to twist anything, Paul. Your words speak for themselves." The air in the studio was thick with unspoken tension. Crew members held their breath. Producers in control room exchanged wide-eyed glances. And Paul, seasoned, battle-hardened Paul, realized too late that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career, because the cameras were still rolling, and the internet was watching. Paul Danning had made an unforced error, and the consequences were immediate. The atmosphere in the studio was thick, with an almost tangible tension. The control room, usually filled with the quiet hum producers monitoring sound levels and camera angles, was suddenly abuzz with nervous energy. But inside the interview space, there was only silence, a silence that stretched, heavy and unforgiving. Karoline Leavitt sat still, her expression poised but unreadable, allowing the moment to breathe. She didn't need to pounce. Paul had already dug his own grave. The audience, both in the studio and watching from home, felt the weight of his words. The damage was done, and in the era of social media, words had an afterlife of their own. Within seconds, clips from the exchange began surfacing online. The first upload was a short, unedited snippet, just 15 seconds of pure controversy. It contained Paul's words, his dismissive tone, his thinly veiled frustration. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. No context, no lead-in, just a raw, unfiltered moment. And that was enough. The clip spread like wildfire. First, it appeared on Twitter, shared by an anonymous account with the caption, "This is what media arrogance looks like. Unbelievable." Then, the retweets began. Within minutes, prominent conservative voices were sharing it, amplifying the outrage. Within an hour, major political commentators were weighing in. Hashtag Fire Paul Danning. Hashtag Media Bias Exposed. Hashtag Karoline was right. The hashtags began trending, fueled by a mix of genuine outrage and opportunistic engagement. The clip made its way to Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Political influencers dissected the moment frame by frame, discussing Paul's body language, his tone, the exact second his confidence wavered. Some called it a revealing slip, proof of the mainstream media's contempt for conservatives. Others tried to downplay it, arguing that the comment had been taken out of context. But the full-length video, once released, only made things worse. Instead of clarifying Paul's position, it solidified the perception that he had not only been aggressive but dismissive and condescending. Within 3 hours, major news outlets had picked up the story. By midday, it was no longer just an online controversy. It was a full-blown media crisis. For MBS News, the network behind the Morning Current, the outrage wasn't just about public perception. It was about business. The television industry, after all, runs on advertising dollars, and controversy like this was bad for business. The first sponsor to pull out was a national insurance company. Their official statement was carefully worded, but the message was clear. While we support free speech and healthy debate, we also believe in respect and fairness. Given the controversy surrounding Paul Danning's recent remarks, we are pausing our sponsorship of the Morning Current pending further review. The second sponsor, a major coffee brand, announced a similar decision within the hour. By late afternoon, 5 more companies had suspended their advertising contracts. The network was in full-blown damage control mode. Internal meetings stretched late into the evening as executives debated their options. Should they defend Paul and risk alienating viewers and advertisers? Or should they cut ties and attempt to salvage their reputation? For years, Paul Danning had been one of their top anchors, a veteran journalist with a loyal following. But now he was a liability. And in the world of television, liabilities don't last long. The following morning, NBS News released an official statement. Paul Danning has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. NBS News remains committed to respectful and fair journalism. It was a classic corporate move, a suspension, not a firing, a pause, not conclusion. But the public wasn't satisfied. To Paul's critics, the suspension was too little, too late. They wanted him fired. They wanted accountability. To them, this wasn't just about one comment. It was about a long-standing pattern of media arrogance. To Paul's supporters, the suspension was proof of cancel culture run amok. They argued that he was being punished for one bad moment, that his words had been misinterpreted, that the network was caving to an outrage mob. No one was happy. And Karoline? She remained silent. She didn't issue statements. She didn't demand his firing. She simply retweeted the viral clip with a single emoji, thinking face. It was a small move, but an effective one, because the storm wasn't over yet. Inside the NBS News headquarters, executives were watching the backlash escalate in real time. Advertisers weren't just pausing sponsorships anymore. They were pulling out completely. Viewers were flooding the network's email inbox with complaints. Other media outlets were piling on, using Paul Danning's comments as an example of media elitism. By noon, it was clear a suspension wasn't going to be enough. At exactly 9:15 a.m. the next morning, NBS News made its final decision. Effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors. It was over. Paul Danning, the once untouchable host, the media veteran who had spent years shaping conversations, was gone. For some, his firing was a long overdue reckoning, a sign that even powerful media figures couldn't talk down a half the country and get away with it. For others, it was cancel culture at its worst, a reminder that no one was safe, that a single moment, one misstep, could erase decades of experience. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear. Paul Danning was finished. And Karoline Leavitt? She hadn't just debated a TV host. She had changed the game. Paul Danning's firing was supposed to put the controversy to rest. Instead, it ignited a deeper debate that stretched far beyond a morning current, beyond Karoline Leavitt, and even beyond Paul himself. The conversation fractured into 2 camps. One side saw his termination as long overdue accountability. To them, this wasn't about cancel culture. It was about consequences. Paul had been in the business for decades, wielding his platform with unchecked authority. His condescending attitude toward conservatives, his dismissive tone, and his refusal to acknowledge bias in mainstream media had been on display for years. This wasn't an isolated moment of frustration. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, media arrogance. To his critics, Paul Danning's downfall sent a message. No matter how powerful, no matter how respected, no one was untouchable anymore. But the other side, the side that had once respected Paul's sharp analysis, even when they disagreed with him, saw his firing as an ominous warning. So a man loses his job over a single comment, they asked. What happened to debate? What happened to context? Conservative media pounced on the story, framing Paul's termination as yet another example of a rigged system, a world where the wrong opinion could cost you everything. Fox News ran headlines like, "Mainstream media purges its own. Who's next?" The Daily Wire declared, "Cancel culture claims another victim." Newsmax aired an entire segment titled, "How Karoline Leavitt Took Down a Liberal Media Giant." The debate spilled over into podcasts, radio shows, and op-eds. Was Paul's comment truly offensive? Was the punishment justified? Or was this just another case of social media mobs dictating corporate decisions? No one could agree. And then Paul broke his silence. For days, Paul Danning had remained silent, disappearing from the public eye. The network had erased his presence, pulling his bio from their website, removing old clips from their archives, pretending as if he had never existed. But Paul wasn't done. Late one evening, a new video appeared on his personal Twitter account. No flashy production, no newsroom set, just Paul, sitting in a dimly lit home office, looking straight into the camera. I was fired because I spoke the truth. His voice was steady, but his expression was tired. The media doesn't want truth. They want compliance. If you step out of line, if you challenge the narrative, they erase you. And that's exactly what happened to me. The video was just under 5 minutes, but every second was loaded with intent. Paul painted himself as a casualty of the establishment, a man cast out not for what he said, but for daring to say it. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Every journalist, every commentator, every American who has ever been afraid to speak their mind. If they can do this to me, they can do it to you. The response was immediate. His supporters rallied, calling for boycotts of NBS News. His critics scoffed, calling his video a desperate plea for relevance. But the numbers didn't lie. Within hours, the video racked up millions of views. His Twitter following surged. Conservative media figures reached out, inviting him onto their platforms. By the end of the week, he had announced his next move, a new independent show, launched on YouTube and backed by private donors. It was titled The Danning Report, and it promised unfiltered truth, free from corporate oversight. In less than a month, he had more viewers than he ever did on the Morning Current. Paul Danning had been fired, but he wasn't finished. While the media world erupted over Paul's firing and comeback, Karoline Leavitt remained curiously silent. She didn't release statements. She didn't do a victory lap. She didn't engage in the social media war raging around her name. She didn't need to. She had already won. Her name was now cemented as a rising conservative force, a woman who had stood her ground, who had forced an industry veteran into a career-ending mistake. She hadn't demanded Paul's firing, but it had happened anyway. She hadn't led the backlash, but it had carried her to new heights. And when she finally did speak, it was in the most measured, calculated way possible. She appeared on a major conservative talk show a week later, sitting across from a host who asked her point blank, "Do you think Paul Danning should have been fired?" She paused. The audience leaned in, and then she delivered a masterclass in political strategy. "I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words." That was it. No gloating, no anger, no divisive rhetoric. Just a simple statement. And with that, she ensured that her name remained untarnished, that she couldn't be accused of leading the charge to cancel Paul Danning. Instead, she positioned herself as a calm, reasoned voice in the chaos, a move that only increased her credibility. While Paul scrambled to rebuild his career, Karoline continued her ascent, appearing on more shows, gaining more followers, receiving more invitations to speak. She had played the game perfectly, and she had won. The dust settled, but the questions Paul Danning's firing had raised didn't go away. Was this a victory for accountability, or proof that outrage mobs control the media? Was Paul a journalist who got what he deserved, or a warning sign of a dangerous new reality where a single moment could end a career? Mainstream media framed it as justice served, a lesson that words have consequences. Right-wing commentators warned that it was just the beginning, that soon anyone who dared to challenge the status quo would face the same fate. And social media? It moved on. A new controversy, a new scandal. But for the people paying attention, Paul Danning's downfall wasn't just another media moment. It was a shift, a sign that the rules were changing. that power was shifting, that the media landscape would never be the same. In the end, it all comes down perspective. To some, Paul Danning's firing was long overdue. To others, it was proof that free speech was under attack. So what do you think? Was justice served? Or was this cancel culture going too far? The conversation isn't over. And the next time a moment like this happens, the question will remain, whose side will you be on?